This is called I Knew and They Knew. Every time I pumped a gallon of gas, I knew and they knew. And they knew I knew, and I knew that they knew I knew that I really had no choice in the matter. They could charge 26 cents a gallon, which I have paid, 50 cents a gallon, which I have paid, $1 a gallon, which I have paid, $2 a gallon, which I have paid, $3 a gallon, and I've paid that, and $4 a gallon, which I've paid, or $5 a gallon, which I have paid, and I was going to pay it because I have to have a car, and it has to take me where I want to go, and that takes gas. There's no choice. There's no option. They own me, and I don't really have a goddamn thing to say about it. And the guy with a gas station, he gets a little bit, and the state gets a bit, the federal government gets a bit, and the refinery gets quite a bit. The country where the oil comes from gets quite a bit. The guy who boats it over here gets a bit. And actually, the least of these is the guy with a gas station right here in town. He gets 4 cents a gallon. And I knew, and they knew that I knew, and I knew they knew I knew, that if gasoline goes to $6 a gallon, I'll pay it, and $7 a gallon, I'll pay it, and $8 a gallon, and I'll pay it, and $9 a gallon, and I'll pay that. And they will all make just a little bit more when I do, and I'll have just a little bit less. And I don't really have a goddamn thing to say about it. Just to remind me that I knew, and they knew I knew, and I knew they knew I knew. In 1978, we had a little gas shortage in Southern California where we waited in line for hours on end just to get the 10 gallons they would allow us, that was the limit, at any price they wanted. And we tried to live our lives on that 10 gallons before going back to get at the end of the line one more time for another 10 gallons. It went on for over a year, and I didn't have a goddamn thing to say about it. Had to have a car. It had to have gas. And I even knew, and they knew I knew, and I knew they knew I knew, that they could take the money I put in that pump for gasoline and cut it up 17 ways. There was still enough left over. In the end, I trained fine young men who otherwise lived as I lived and wanted what I wanted. That the reason they couldn't have what I have is that my land was the land of Satan, bent on their destruction and in defiance of the laws of God and men, and that they would indeed be rewarded in paradise if they but gave their lives to destroy our land and kill thousands of innocent people, to teach them a lesson by taking away forever their fathers and their husbands and their wives and aunts and uncles and mothers, all in the name of Allah. And even then, I would continue to feed that pump. And I would feed it, and I would feed it, and I would feed it forever. And I would feed it because I really don't have a goddamn thing to say about it. Nothing at all. What I also knew, and they knew, and they didn't know I knew that they knew because so few knew and they knew that few knew, is that gasoline and my car was spewing toxins out the ass end that cause autism, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, diabetes, and a host of other diseases that were virtually unheard of a century ago. And even though I knew and they knew, they kept right on selling it. And I kept right on buying it. I kept feeding that pump and driving that car, and I didn't have a goddamn thing to say about it. And then one day with my American Express card clutched in one hand and the pump nozzle in the other, watching the poor guy who owned the gas station change the sign to raise the price of it all one more time, something snapped inside. Something just broke. I said, that's it. And I put the pump nozzle back in the pump. I left my car right where it was at. parked next to the pump, and I walked all the way home. But they knew, and I knew they knew that I knew that you just can't live your life walking. You have to carry stuff, and it gets cold, and it gets hot, and it rains, and it snows. People attack you if you're walking. They take away the stuff you're trying to carry, and it takes too much time, and it just doesn't work. And you really just don't have a goddamn thing to say about it. You have to have a car. It has to have gas. And so in tears, I went into my garage and got a glass of whiskey, sat down on an old tire and drank it, and muttered and drank it and stewed, drank it and muttered some more, but I still didn't have a goddamn thing to say about it. So in anger and in frustration, I took a car and I ripped out the engine, and I ripped out the gas tank. I ripped out the exhaust pipe and the radiator and the lead-acid battery, and I ripped it and I tore it until there was nothing but a bare car with no way to move it, a dead car. I had killed it. This car would drink no more. And without it, I would drive no more. So I got on the internet and started randomly ordering parts, electric motors, batteries, chargers, and DC to DC converters, cables, and terminals, and wires, wherever I could find them, in whatever condition they were in, at whatever price was asked. A huge pile of stuff. And I pieced them together over days and weeks and months, and I didn't know, and they didn't know. So I didn't know if they didn't know, that I didn't know if it would ever work. But I kind of obsessed on it. And I drank my whiskey, and I pieced together things that didn't want to go together, and I fit parts together that didn't want to fit together. I made things work together that were not made to work together. I sawed and I ground and I filed, I hammered, I drilled, I welded, I fit and I fumed and I flailed. It was a futile act, a waste of time, a tinkering of a frail old man with too much whiskey, too much time on his hands. Alone in a garage with a bunch of junk he'd found laying around and cobbled together, one of his erratic, eccentric spasms of obstinate, rebellious mutterings and maunderings, a laughing stock of his town and the sorrowful and apologetic excuse of his wife and children for just being that way, and you can't change him. What's to be done about it anyway? And they all shake their heads and go on about their lives. One afternoon, after drinking a good bit of whiskey and playing with some high voltage, I decided it was time to go for a drive. So I got in the car and I turned the key and pressed on the accelerator. The car shot out of the garage, down the driveway, crashed through the wrought iron fence and into the street sideways and stopped. I ruefully untangled the car from the pieces of fencing that it so proudly wore and pushed it by hand back into the garage, turned out the lights and shut the door, and went to bed, wet, tired, and defeated. A few adjustments, perhaps still in order. Wife, what happened to the fence? It got in my goddamn way and started asking a bunch of silly-ass questions. What do you want to know about it? Nothing at all. But she knew, and I knew, and she knew I knew she knew that it wasn't going so well in the garage. She sat hands folded in embarrassment and shame that her hero was failing and perhaps beginning to lose it. None the younger, never really liked the other wives' husbands, and now this, weeks and months and the money, and so distant and distracted, and he sure looks old. What would her friends say? What to tell the children? But she also knew, and I knew, and she knew that I knew, that she knew that she didn't have a goddamn thing to say about it. So more whiskey, more high voltage, more sawing, more drilling, some software changes, and time for another drive. And finally I turned the key. Nothing, not a sound. I very carefully pressed the accelerator, and the car rolled quietly out into the driveway. Stunned, I'd sat a few moments in silence in the sun, and then I drove it away. And I drove it 90 miles an hour on the first drive, and on the second I drove it 109 miles before recharging it. And I drove it through the town, and I drove it on the interstate highway. I drove it down Main Street, and I drove it down Broadway. I drove it on country roads and twisting asphalt, up hills and down hills. I drove it through water, and I drove it over and over again. And I stopped it, and I accelerated it, and I did it over and over again. It was entirely silent. It made no gases or smells at all. And the gearbox didn't act like it did before. You could take off in any gear you wanted, and it accelerated smoothly and continuously from stop to about 50 miles an hour. And you shifted into fourth, and it was born again, accelerating smoothly from 50 to 90 miles an hour. I'd never felt anything like it. And it drove on and on and on with no gasoline in it at all. Instead of anger, there should be joy, but not. In fact, the anger rose higher and hotter until the vision narrows to a point and the head pounds in a rhythmic beat. Wait a minute. Hold it. If a 54-year-old guy can build a car in his garage out of scrap parts and discards that goes 90 miles an hour and over 100 miles without gasoline, working half days, falling down drunk on homemade moonshine whiskey, while 250 million other cars are out there rolling around and sucking up gasoline and paying at the pump because they don't have a goddamn thing to say about it. What's wrong with this picture? And suddenly I knew. They had to know. And finally I knew that they knew. The bastards had known all along. But I knew that they didn't know now that I knew. And more than this, knowing finally and for once and for all gave me something to say about it. And here's what I have to say about that. Fuck off and die. Because I'm not just not going to pay at the pump anymore. And I'm not going to just not be a victim. I'm outing you. I'm out of this game. And I'm telling anyone that will listen that they can be out of this game too. And then they will know. And they will also know that you know. And in fact, they'll know that you know and knew all along. And here's the kicker. There's not a goddamn thing you can say about it, bitch. Electric cars are not about being cool. Electric cars are not about having fun. Electric cars are not even really about saving the planet. Electric cars are the biggest fuck off and die one man can ever speak and utter and actually make it stick. And if anybody anywhere thinks they're about anything else, they just haven't yet converted an electric car. You can buy a Prius and you may save the odd snail darter. You might feel good and you might feel smarmy about the planet, but you have nothing to do with me. Sucking up a little less is not what I'm about. Yes, Rodney, we can all get along. Right after they fuck off and die. Make no mistake, this is a global, technical, societal and cultural revolution with many trillions in resources at stake, yours, mine, and theirs. There will be casualties. We are too small a force to take prisoners, so don't take any. Scorched earth. And that's what I have to say about that.